The following is a land acknowledgement from Art New York. We would like to take this time to acknowledge that, wherever we're currently located on Turtle Island, otherwise known as North America, we are in occupied territory. Art New York's membership in the 5 boroughs of New York City operates on the unceded ancestral land of the Lenape, Wappinger, Canarsie, Rockaway, and Matinecock communities. We want to honor and celebrate all of these Indigenous communities, their elders past and present, as well as future generations. We also want to take this time to acknowledge that after there was stolen land, there were stolen people. We want to honor the generations of displaced and enslaved people that build and continue to build the country we occupy today. Since we are gathered today in virtual space, let's also take a moment to consider the legacies of colonization embedded within the technologies, structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. We're using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many Indigenous communities. Even the technologies that are central to much of the art we make leave significant carbon footprints, contributing to changing climates that disproportionately affect Indigenous peoples worldwide. We invite you to join us in acknowledging all of this as well as our shared responsibility to make good of this time and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, anti-racism, and allyship. Thank you. The virtual part of the land acknowledgement was written by Adrian Wong of Spiderweb Show in Ontario, Canada. To learn more about whose land you are on, visit native-land.ca. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third module in our Disability 101 series, Language of Disability. For this first slide is our title slide with the Art New York logo in the bottom left-hand corner and the MAC logo on the bottom right-hand corner. On this slide, we're just reminding you once again where you are. We have covered so far what is disability, disability and theater, and now we are on the language of disability that is highlighted in yellow on my slide with a red arrow that says we are here. On this slide, our goals are listed for this module. We will learn about person first and identity first language, common ableist terms and alternative options, and terminology for specific disabilities. So first and foremost, disability is not a bad word. And on my slide, it says exactly that in big capital letters. Disability is not a bad word. And in a few slides, Kirsten is going to go over language that we use in society to talk around the word disability. But let's move on to person first versus identity first language. People first language puts the person before the diagnosis, and it describes what a person has rather than what a person is, and it avoids using labels or adjectives. The People First movement started off by self-advocates with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the late 1980s, but it was also heavily promoted by AIDS activists. It's still largely preferred by some groups like people with Down syndrome and people with intellectual disabilities and older generations. On the other hand, we have identity first language, which embraces disability as an identity. You cannot separate my disability from who I am, and you shouldn't have to do linguistic gymnastics to be reminded that I'm a person. And if you have to use first person language to remind you that I'm a human being, then my disability is not the problem. Identity first language is highly preferred by autistics and deaf individuals, as well as by younger disabled people in general. Alrighty, this brings my portion of Module 3 to a close. I will pass it to Kirsten to pick back up with euphemisms. Take it away, Kirsten.
All right, hi everyone, Kirsten here. So now we are going to talk about some language that you should and shouldn't use when you're talking about disabled people. And I want to preface this by saying that we can never make a 100% generalized statement about language that people do and don't prefer. every disabled person is an individual, and every individual is going to have different preferences about the language that they like. So when you're speaking with an individual, it's always fine to ask somebody what language they prefer. What we're going to be talking about today are just sort of general trends about what most people do and don't prefer. So we're going to start by talking about some euphemisms that you should avoid when talking about disability. A euphemism is essentially a term that you use to avoid saying the real thing that you're talking about. So in this case, these are terms that are used to talk about disability without saying the word disability. These euphemisms can feel very patronizing and can also sort of feed into the mindset that disability is something negative. So we can't say the word, we have to say something else. So some euphemisms to avoid: differently abled is a big one. Special needs, this is one that you'll still hear used a lot in especially education and school settings. So it's a harder one to avoid, but disabled people's needs are not special. Everybody has needs, and we don't need to be in sort of our own separate special category because we also have needs. Handy capable, again, just very patronizing, and challenged in the sense of physically or mentally challenged. Without, always just say disability. We don't need to use these terms. On our next slide now, we are going to be talking about some harmful language and some slurs that we should really strongly avoid when talking about disability. We won't be saying the slurs, they'll be censored on screen. But if you don't want to hear any harmful language or slurs today, feel free to skip ahead in the video about a minute, where we'll be talking about alternative language, positive language to use when talking about disability. But I'm going to change the slide now. A few slurs that, especially if you are non-disabled, you should absolutely avoid when talking about disability. First of all is the R word that's used to talk about people with intellectual or any kind of cognitive disability. That is sort of a hard no. Please do not use that word. Crippled is another sort of general word that's considered a slur for talking about disabled people, with the sort of caveat that as many marginalized communities have done, a lot of disabled folks have reclaimed this term for the community and use it as a term of pride, especially the term crip, which you may have seen before. So you may see this word, but if you're not disabled, please do not use it, and especially do not use it to describe a disabled person. Another slur that you absolutely should not use is the M slur that's used to describe little people or people with dwarfism. If you don't know what words I'm referring to with either of these censored terms, feel free to look them up on your own, but I am not going to say them. A few other terms that are not necessarily slurs, but are pretty harmful language that you should try to avoid. Number one is invalid. This is a super outdated term, so I imagine not many people are using it anymore anyway, but wanted to put it in here just to note that you should not use it. Impaired, in the sense of hearing impaired, is something that for a lot of deaf people is really, really not preferred. And so you should avoid that language. You can say deaf, hard of hearing, anything like that instead. Visually impaired is a little less of a negative connotation for some folks. Some people still really don't prefer it, or don't like really any impairment language at all. Some people don't mind it as much, but when in doubt, avoid using sort of impairment-based language when talking about disability. And last is handicapped. This is just a pretty outdated term, and we use disabled now. So that's a term that you can try to phase out of your vocabulary if it's still in there. And now we are going to talk about what you can say instead. So on the next couple of slides, there will be a table that on the left-hand side says instead of, with a list of some harmful or ableist language. And then on the right says say, with some alternatives that you can say instead. So instead of saying blinded to, blinded by, or deaf to, you can say deliberately ignoring or overcome by. And this is something that you'll see as a trend throughout these next couple of slides, that basically instead of using disability as a metaphor, just say what you mean. So when you're saying that someone was deaf to what you're saying, or that, you know, something was falling on deaf ears, you're using deafness as a metaphor to mean that someone is deliberately ignoring you or is not hearing what you're saying. So just say what you mean instead of using disability as a metaphor. Instead of saying words like crazy, insane, psycho, lunatic, these terms that are considered ableist by a lot of folks with mental health disabilities, mental illness, things like that, you can say something is wild, unpredictable, out of control, etc., not necessarily using terms that refer to someone's mental state in a derogatory way. Instead of saying that someone is confined to a wheelchair or they're wheelchair bound, this terminology that really paints a wheelchair as something restrictive, something confining, you can say that someone is a wheelchair user or that they use a wheelchair. Wheelchairs are tools of freedom. They help people get around. Crippling or crippled by in our language, referring to things like crippling debt, or, you know, being crippled by something, again, metaphorically. Let's say what we mean. Let's say that something is devastating or that someone was overwhelmed by something. We should also avoid language like dumb, stupid, idiot, moron. A lot of this terminology that we use to refer to people's cognitive ability, especially idiot and moron, were actually in previous centuries medical terminology that were used to categorize people with intellectual disabilities into different sort of tiers of cognitive ability. So these terms have really ableist roots in really harmful medical practices towards people with intellectual disabilities, and we should avoid using them if we can. So instead, as I keep saying, just say what you mean. You can use terms like ignorant, foolish, or someone lacks understanding. Lame is a term that I think has really sort of shifted in the cultural use, in that these days it's mostly used to mean that something isn't cool. But the origins of the term lame, similarly to terms like moron and idiot, it's a medical origin, and it's talking about having some kind of physical disability in a limb or something like that that affects the way you can walk. So again, moving away from language that has this kind of ableist background, say what you mean. Say that something's uncool, it's uninteresting, it's boring. I mentioned this term earlier, but instead of using the M slur, you should refer to somebody as a little person or a person with dwarfism. Rather than using mental illness as a metaphor, so saying something like, I'm so OCD, I'm so bipolar, etc., say what you mean. Unless you actually have those disabilities, you are probably misrepresenting them by using them to describe different aspects of your personality. Instead of saying that somebody is schizophrenic in their behavior, again, using disability as a metaphor, you can say they're wild, unpredictable, erratic, etc. And in general, when talking about disability, instead of saying that someone suffers from a disability or is a victim of some kind of disability, you can use the person first or identity first language that they prefer. So here is some language that you can use when talking about different specific disabilities. And we just have this language listed on the screen. You can say that this person is blind or has low vision. If they're not, you can say this person is sighted. You can say this person is deaf or hard of hearing. If they're not, you can say this person is hearing. You can say this person is autistic or neurodivergent. And if they're not, you can say this person is allistic or neurotypical. And one thing I will say about the term neurodivergent is that it is not synonymous with autistic. Neurodivergency, that's sort of an umbrella term, and autism does fall under that umbrella, but so do other cognitive disabilities like ADHD, Tourette's syndrome, dyslexia, schizophrenia, OCD, lots of different disabilities that affect the way the brain is neurologically wired. You can say that someone is chronically ill or has a chronic illness. You can say this person is mad with a capital M. I'll come back to that in a second. Or this person has a mental illness. Mad is another reclaimed term that some folks with different kinds of psychiatric disabilities, different mental illnesses may use to describe themselves. So mad with a capital M is a term that can be used by folks within that community. If you're not within that community, you shouldn't use it to describe somebody who is. You can say a person has a mobility disability if they have a disability that impacts the way that they move. You can say that somebody is non-speaking if they don't speak. For example, there are many autistic people who are non-speaking who use alternative forms of communication. As I said earlier, you can say a person is a wheelchair user. And if someone does not have a disability, you can say this person is non-disabled. And that term non-disabled is a term that a lot of disabled people, myself included, prefer over able-bodied as the alternative to disabled. That is twofold, both because using non-disabled sort of centers disability, and then, you know, if you're not that, then you get the sort of prefix to your identifier, just a way of sort of subverting the dominant power dynamics, and also because not all disabilities affect the body. So an autistic person can be able-bodied if their autism doesn't really affect them physically in any way, but they still are disabled. All right, and that concludes our model about language and disability. And our next and final module will be looking at anti-ableism and disability justice.